Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the Save the Frogs Academy class. My name is Michael Starkey. I'm the the advisory committee chairman and ecologist for Save the Frogs. And today we're going to be talking about amphibians of California. And so we're going to talk about identification of species in California, some of the threats they face, and what you all can do to help amphibians. I have another long presentation to give today, and so if you have any questions, please chat them to me in the questions box, and I will be sure to try and answer them during the presentation and at the end of the presentation. During about the middle of the presentation, I'm going to have a time to answer a few questions, and then I'll move on. So to get started, amphibians in California, we're going to learn about the different species of amphibians in the area, but first we need to understand what an amphibian is. And so an amphibian is a Greek word meaning two lives. So like this Pseudacris cadaverina or a canyon tree frog, we need to understand where these species start their lives, and many of them start life in water. And that's what that Greek word means, having two lives, starting life in water and ending on land. And amphibians have been around for a long time, and some of the oldest fossil records found amphibians to be 362 million years old. So amphibians have been around for a very long time. And we've had species in California for a long time as well. And just in case there are anyone that is a little confused, because sometimes this might come up, is it a reptile or an amphibian? Because we have one species of lizard in California called the horned lizard or the horned toad, which is pictured on the screen, that many people actually do think it's an amphibian. But this is a reptile and has scaly skin and lays eggs, hard-shelled eggs. Amphibians have smooth, permeable skin that allows nutrients and water to flow through it. And also, they have soft jelly-like eggs. And amphibians are linked to water. So right back to that word amphibian, meaning two lives. And most amphibians, especially in California, start life in water. They start life as a tadpole. And one species that is only present in California is the California tiger salamander. It's an endemic species. And this is a species that I spent about 3 years studying the larval development. So what we have here is a tiger salamander egg with the embryo in there. A big female California tiger salamander will lay about 800 eggs, one or two at a time, in vernal pools and cattle ponds, and basically ephemeral water sources. After a few weeks, those eggs are going to hatch out to be little larvae. So frogs and toads are called, tadpoles, polywogs. They have those cute names, but salamander are stuck with that name, larvae. But interesting about the California tiger salamander is that they're truly a predator of the pond, and their name actually means stomach mouth. Ambystoma californiense means stomach mouth, because if you look at their larvae, they have a giant head with just a little tail, and just because they can fit anything in their mouth that lives in the pond. And they also have these gorgeous gills that stick off the side of their head. Tadpoles and toads, they have, or polywogs, they have, so frogs and toads have internal gills, so the gills are inside their body, but salamander and newt larvae, for the most part, have external gills. And after a few months, these gills are going to be absorbed into their body, they're going to grow legs, and they're actually going to develop lungs, and they're going to come out onto land like this tiger salamander here. You can still see it has part of its tail fin, and if we did zoom in right here, you actually have remaining gill buds. But these animals go out into the California landscape and find a burrow to escape the summer heat, because these species actually metamorphose during the intense summers of California. They go out at night and then they go find a burrow that night. So very, very important process, metamorphosis, unique to amphibian species by being vertebrates. And there's about 7,000 species of amphibians around the globe, and most of these are frogs and toads. There's about 6,000 species of frogs and toads. And in California, we have about 30 species. And I say about just because there's some debate about which species are truly here. The more we study genetics and taxonomy, we find that certain species might actually be multiple species. So there's about 30 species in California. So the diversity is quite low. For example, in places like the Philippines, small island nation, they have, about 300 species of amphibians. But that's because the climate in California is much more limited for frogs to survive in. But what's the difference between a frog and a toad? And so frogs, this is a California red-legged frog, another species that only lives in California. And they have nice smooth skin, they have webbed feet, and they like to hang around water most of the time. And so that's one way you could tell it's a frog, smooth skin, nice big webbed feet. And what we have here is a toad. So this is a western toad. And we know it's a toad because it has this bumpy skin. The toes aren't nearly as webbed as those frogs. And they also have these large parotoid glands or poison glands behind the head, which is a great way to deter predators because they taste quite bad. And some species of toads can make animals quite sick. The western toad isn't nearly that bad. And this bumpy skin actually allows them to store water inside their body, and they can actually travel far away from water sources. And that's why some toads can actually live in some of the harshest environments. And so frog calls are also really cool thing about amphibians in California. For example, the amphibian that's most well known, I would say, is the Pacific chorus frog because of its unique call, and you also hear them in Hollywood movies. So if you ever hear in a movie, that ribbit, 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 that's probably a Pacific chorus frog because instead of going out to the location wherever they're supposed to be filming, they just go behind the studios in LA and collect chorus frog calls if they need frog calls. So it's a very famous frog for that reason. But every species of call has, or every species of frog has a different call. And so remember, there's about 6,000 different frogs species on the planet, and so each one has its own unique call for its species. And so there's about 600 species of newts on the planet, not too many compared to the 6,000 species of frogs. But in California, the diversity is quite good. So we have about 50 species here in California. And I mean, if anyone's a California native, you'll definitely recognize this species that's on the screen. It's a slender salamander. You find them almost all over California, except in the deserts. And even in some desert regions, you can find them actually. But these little slender type salamanders, some species, they only get about 2 to 3 inches long. Many people confuse them for earthworms, but they are actually amphibians. And this species actually doesn't go through metamorphosis, it goes through direct development. So it lays its eggs in moist, rotting logs or underneath plants in just moist soil. And then it'll stay with them, and these eggs will hatch out just to be little versions of the adult. So this is called direct development. Another interesting thing about these salamanders, they don't have lungs. They're in the group Plethodontidae, and they actually don't have lungs. They breathe through their skin. So it's very important to have clean environments for these guys. But the reason we have so much diversity in California is because we have a cool Mediterranean climate. And so many amphibian species are able to live along the coast or in some of our mountains. And so those salamanders like those cool areas to live in. And the last group are the caecilians that we like to talk about. There's about 200 species of caecilians. These are limbless amphibians, but they're only found in the tropics, so around the equator. So unfortunately, it's a very cool amphibian, but we don't have them here in California. But where do amphibians live in California? And if you were to go find amphibians, again, like if you want to find salamanders, going to the redwoods is a great place. Forests with lots of rotting logs, like this red-bellied newt, which is found in Humboldt County. So amphibians like to be somewhere where there's cover and where they can feel safe, and also to stay cool and moist. That's very, very important for amphibians, that they stay wet so they don't desiccate. But if we we're up in Northern California, we're traveling south. This is Central California. And if you think about Central California, much of it is almost like a desert. It's grasslands. During the summer, it's hot. And during the winter, we have very, pretty intense cold, not too intense because we don't really get too much snow, but we have lots of rain during the months of December through February and maybe up into April and spring. And so that's a time when amphibians in the Central Valley, they flock to their breeding pools during the winter, and then they breed. And so what we have here is actually a cattle pond in Livermore, California. And Livermore, it's basically just outside the Bay Area of like San Francisco, Berkeley area. And what you can have in these cattle ponds, because originally California used to be a giant wetland, so the whole Central Valley used to flood. But when people came, we dammed up rivers and we started converting this water or diverting water into agriculture. And what happens is it changes the landscape. Where the Central Valley used to be a giant wetland, now it's into cattle grazing and much of crops. So there's a lot of agriculture in California. And so where we used to have lots of ephemeral or temporary water ponds and vernal pools, now really some of the only water is available are vernal pools, not vernal pools, well, vernal pools and cattle ponds. And these cattle ponds, like right here, are a haven for species that are pond breeding species. And so this is that tiger salamander again. They're completely dependent on these pools now because that's what's the only thing that's left in their habitat. And they do quite well actually. So in this pond in particular, we not only found thousands of tiger salamander larvae, which are endangered species, but California red-legged frogs, toads, and those Pacific chorus frogs as well, and newts too. So you have so many species that'll just flock to these ponds because it's the only habitat that's available. But even if we keep going further south, the desert, how do species survive in the desert? Well, many species, they have different strategies of living in the desert, and one way is to find that desert oasis. So there are many springs that flow all year round and provides a haven for species like this. These are red-spotted toads, and they flock around these little oases. But also, some species have different tactics about living in the desert environment, but I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So I'm going to go through an identification of some of the species that we can find in California. And here's that very special Pacific chorus frog, Pseudacos regilla, the one that you hear in all the Hollywood movies. So, and this is actually an adult by an egg mass right over here, and these eggs are getting ready to hatch soon. And so, and when they start life, so this is kind of the awkward transition for a tadpole into a frog. Still has this tadpole face, but it's just recently grown arms and grown legs, but still has a very long tail. So kind of like most teenagers, that awkward stage of life. But they're a beautiful frog, and they're found all over the western United States down into Baja California. So a very cool frog. And then the California red-legged frog is a special frog. Mark Twain made it famous by talking about the Calaveras frog jumping contest. And so this frog was all over the Central Valley, up into Northern California. But unfortunately now it's been displaced by non-native bullfrogs that now inhabit much of its range, and they outcompete these frogs, which is a shame because this was our largest frog in California, and they're now a threatened species. But where they get their name from is their bright red legs. And you can see this one female just has absolute gorgeous coloration here. And some of them do get that quite red, but not all the time. And they have very beautiful tadpoles as well. So they're quite large. They're about the size of a bullfrog tadpole or a ping pong ball. And they have this gold stripe down their lateral or down their sides. That's the one way you can tell the difference between bullfrog tadpoles. Really cool frog. Only lives in the Central Valley of California. And then another species that you can find on the outskirts of the foothills, more again the Central Valley in Northern California, is the yellow-legged frog, the foothill yellow-legged frog. This species is also a threatened species. It's gone from about 40% of its natural range. And much of that is from pollution in the sense of habitat degradation in its water. So it depends on clear flowing streams. And there's been many dams that have been set up in California that they've actually found have when they put in dams that stops these little flowing streams, and that obviously takes the frogs away. And also, too, pesticides. This species is very susceptible to effects from pesticides. So we're seeing a trend of decline in this species. But like given their name, they do have these very beautiful yellow legs. And then another very cool species of frog that you can find in the very tip of Northern California is the tailed frog. And this is a very old species. Some of their closest relatives are on the other side of the world in New Zealand. There's only a few type of tailed frogs in the world, and they call them a tailed frog because they actually do have a tail. But only males have the tail because it's actually not a tail. It's a reproductive organ, and this is the only one of the few species of frogs that actually has internal fertilization, which is definitely unique among amphibians because normally it's all external fertilization. So it's really cool to find this species up in the Northern California region, and they're only associated with clear flowing streams in redwood forest. And if we go further down, we might find some really cool toads down in Southern California, like this red-spotted toad. This is a juvenile, so not too old, probably was born the year we found it. And so again, gorgeous coloration, lots of red bumps all over them. A very, very beautiful, beautiful toad. Um, and then some interesting species that we can find in California are spadefoot. Now, spadefoot, they call them spadefoot toads, but they're actually not a toad. They're a type of frog because they're not like those true toads, like the western toad and the red-spotted toad. The spadefoot is quite an amazing creature, and one because if you look at its, one, it looks strange. I mean, it looks like something straight out of Star Wars. but it's a very unique in the sense of how it survives in the desert. So this animal is completely dependent on rain. And if it doesn't rain in the desert, well, this animal might be in trouble. So, because during the winter rains, these animals surface from the ground. They actually stay underground for most of the year, and then when those desert, summer rains come, they actually come up and come out of the ground. And so that's when they feed, they reproduce, and then when those rains go away, they go back underground. And they're able to do that because they actually have spades on their feet. They have these amazing adaptations for digging in the sand. And when you find one and you put it on the ground, it immediately starts digging, 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 digging. And they can go quite deep into the ground. So these animals are specially adapted to live in these desert environments and escape that summer or that hot heat. And we have some spadefoots further up into California, in the Central Valley, even parts of Northern California. This is the western spadefoot, Spea hamandi. And again, it is a threatened species just because of habitat loss. Much of California has been converted into farmland, and these species also, like the tiger salamander, depend on vernal pools and ephemeral wetlands to breed in. And this species, because it's all turning to cattle country and agriculture, it's losing its habitat. And then bullfrogs. I already answered this, but are bullfrogs native? No, they're not. So the bullfrog is an invasive species, and they come from they're originally from the East Coast, and they're introduced into California by the gold miners. So during that time, Mark Twain's writing about the wonderful Calaveras frog jumping contest and these red-legged frogs. Gold miners are also eating all of the California red-legged frogs to extinction, and they extirpated the frogs from the area. So there's no more of those red-legged frogs in that area. But one entrepreneur gold miner thought, well, I used to eat a bunch of bullfrogs back in the day. So he went back east, he brought a ton of frogs back, and thus started a spread of amphibians, these invasive amphibians along the western United States, because the bullfrogs are the largest frog in the United States, and they're a voracious predator, and they can fit anything into their mouth. Well, anything that can fit their mouth, they'll eat it. So they eat red-legged frogs, they eat snakes, birds, they eat all kinds of things. And so they're causing a lot of problem for our native ecosystems. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And now I'm going to move on to the salamanders. So I talked a little about California tiger salamander. Here is a pretty large larval stage. He has his feet here and kind of glowing this green color. They're almost somewhat iridescent in the light. So it's quite a beautiful salamander. And these adults are these absolutely beautiful black with white spots, and known for their tiger salamander smile. So really beautiful amphibian. Another member of the genus Ambystoma is the long-toed salamander, and you can find these up north. And they're very, very beautiful, as you can see. Nice long highlighter striped color down its back. Really cool species. In Santa Cruz, California, we have the Santa Cruz long-toed salamander, which is also another endangered species that, from habitat loss and invasive species, it's having some problems. So. And then the slender salamander, this is a very common species in California. This one is in a defense position right now. And so what they do is they roll up and they'll wiggle their tail. But yeah, very, very common. These species only need, for their entire life, 2 square feet of space to live in. So they can live under the same log their entire life, which is really, really neat for that species. And then a salamander that'll scare the slender salamander. This is the arboreal salamander. And arboreal salamanders, they have quite big teeth and they're voracious predators. They eat a lot of invertebrates, but they also eat salamanders too. And so you can find these in rotten logs. They're only about 5 or 6 inches long. Really cool salamander. And they get their name arboreal because many of these species actually do climb in trees quite a bit. And there's a type of arboreal salamander that lives in the redwoods that only lives at the very, very top of the canopy, and some of the rotting vegetation that accumulates from dead plants falling from the canopy. So really cool species. And then for the newts, this is a rough-skinned newt. And newts are a type of salamander, but they're quite toxic. And so actually the rough-skinned newt, or the genus Tarica, there's 2 or 3 species in the genus Tarica, and they're all quite toxic actually. They're some of the most toxic salamanders on the planet. However, compared to that of like the poison dart frogs, it's nothing. And so while I don't recommend you eat these animals, if you did, it could make you quite sick. Newts, they are a very toxic salamander, but as long as you wash your hands after handling them, you will not be in trouble. So really beautiful animal though. Quite, they move in mass migrations during the winter months when it's pouring rain, and it's actually caused certain counties in California to close their roads where these newts like to travel across the road. And then their larvae are also equally as beautiful. They still have this orangish coloration, but they're defined by these two bright stripes down there, or excuse me, black stripes down their back. Very beautiful, and you can kind of see their gills right over here. Another beautiful larvae. And then the Ensitinas are a type of salamander that scientists have been studying for quite some time because they have a very interesting evolution pattern where it's called the radicris, where they have these species that they started in one part of California and they've moved in this circle. And as they are moving in this circle around the California landscape, they're starting to separate into subspecies as they become isolated from each other. And so Ensitinas are all the same species, but they've been divided up into subspecies. And so and some of them are quite different from each other, which is fascinating. But it's just after thousands of years, the species have changed in such a way. So this is an example of a Monterey Ensitina, which you can find, obviously near Monterey, Santa Cruz area. But if you go further north, you can find species like the Oregon Ensitina, which goes into Oregon and northern California. So really, another really cool group of amphibians. And then I think one of the coolest salamanders in California is the giant salamander. And this species is absolutely huge. Some of them get about 13 inches long, and they are truly monsters. Very, very cool salamanders. They eat banana slugs, which is also really cool because if you've ever seen a banana slug in the redwoods, it's quite an impressive animal. And imagine a salamander eating it, that's pretty cool too. So the giant salamanders are quite cool, live in redwood forests. And you can find their larvae also in redwood streams. They have tiny red gills, but they also have that nice mottled coloration. So really cool group of salamanders. And so if we want to go out and look for amphibians in the wild, it's really important that we be careful because amphibians are sensitive creatures. And so we need to be gentle, identify the species because we don't want to be handling endangered species and only take photos. And honestly, handling should be kept to a minimum because there are amphibian diseases that can be spread between your hands and amphibian to amphibian. And also, too, amphibians, they absorb toxins and chemicals in their skin. So if you have bug repellent on your hand or sunscreen, it's best just not to handle them if you can. And take photos. And when you're done, share that experience with others because it's important to inform other people about looking for amphibians. Many people don't see amphibians, so it's something that they overlook. They're looking for birds or mammals. And so it's important to share that experience if you're out on a hike and you find a salamander crossing your path. Share that experience with others. And so before I move into threats, I wanted to see if anyone um, had any questions about the California amphibians that I've talked about, if or anything of that nature, just before I move on. And if you have a question, you could please type it in, and that would be great. And at the end of the presentation, I will answer questions at the end too. And if you have one, just please type it in at the questions category. All right. With that, I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about the threats facing amphibians. So, to get started, the number one threat to all amphibian species on the planet is habitat degradation. So, amphibians are some of the most threatened group of organisms on the planet, and that number one is because they're losing their homes. And in California, it's the same thing. And I've already given you a few examples about how habitat has been a problem. From converting land from wetlands into cattle pasture or agriculture. But that's a big threat. Is just there are so many people in California that they're causing these threats. Um, Another threat is road mortalities, and I apologize for this graphic photo, and I won't leave it too much longer on the screen. But this is a big female giant salamander that was absolutely full of eggs that was run over by a car on a wet, rainy night. So that's another big threat to facing California amphibians. And again, those bullfrogs, these native or these non-native species of amphibians are causing huge threats. These species were they're still continually imported into the state of California for frog legs. So people eat them, their legs, mostly just their legs. And so what's happening though is that some of these species get out, they get accidentally released or they're bought as pets and they're released when they get too big. They get the size of a small football. And so they're causing quite a few problems for our native species, not only outcompeting them, but in other ways too. So this was a an interesting encounter in Santa Cruz where the executive director of Save the Frogs and myself, we happened upon this guilty-looking couple. And so what we're looking at here is an adult bullfrog, the one on the bottom, and a male red-legged frog is in amplexus with it, so it's breeding. And so the first thought comes to mind, well, it's hybridization issue. Well, no, they're vastly different species, and nothing can come of this. But what this is actually a problem because if you understand the natural ecology of both species, you learn something about this phenomenon. And so when California red-legged frogs naturally breed, they hang out in the riparian or the forest, for a good part of the year. They're staying cool under moist logs. Maybe they'll dip into the stream every now and then, but they'll kind of migrate into these big streams or big pools or ponds. And they'll come during the winter rains. So those winter rains trigger these male frogs to go down the ponds. Naturally, they would call and attract female frogs to the pond. However, when these male frogs are going to these areas with bullfrogs, well, they find these good-looking girls and they just immediately amplex, and then nothing comes of it though. So these frogs don't call. And so what happens is by them not calling, the females never return to the ponds and there's no recruitment. So it's a reproductive trap, basically, where eventually you're just going to have fewer and fewer red-legged frogs because there's no one to breed with, basically. And so that's why this is an issue with these bullfrogs in these other these areas where native California red-legged frogs occur. Also, too, I mean, this bullfrog honestly probably could eat that red-legged frog, and that is a big problem. We've done many, when we've removed bullfrogs from ecosystems, we open their stomachs and we find quite large frogs inside of them, which is a big problem. And another issue with invasive species that many people don't know about, at least, are invasive salamanders. And so when I was working with California tiger salamanders, we were studying how they interacted with a non-native species called the barred tiger salamander and what's been happening because they've been hybridizing. Back in the 1950s, there was a cattle rancher in Salinas that missed his nice bass bait that he used to have in Texas. He's a Texan, and he moved to California, and he was disappointed that the tiger salamanders don't go through something called pedomorphism, which when they stay in their larval stage, like a mud puppy or an axolotl, and barred tiger salamanders do this. They'll stay these big, large larval salamanders, and apparently they make great bass bait. You can catch striped bass and all these things. So he brought truckloads of them and dumped them into his ponds, these barred tiger salamanders, into his cattle ponds and some friends' cattle ponds. And little did he know what damage he caused because the tiger salamanders started interbreeding. So these species are closely related and they're able to produce viable offspring. And so if we look at this slide, we were looking at the growth rates between the species, and we have a native California, three native California tiger salamanders, and we have a hybrid right here. And so it's interesting that we found that when we had these animals in experiments and under basically the same treatment, so they're offered the same amount of food, they're out in a pond, they all grow at different rates. But the native and the invasive barred tiger salamanders kind of grow about the same time, but the hybrid salamanders has best of both traits from the other species, and they grow very well and they survive so much better in California's climate. So now we have this problem where we have this hybrid genes that are spreading all over the Central Valley. And so to give you an idea what that pedomorph looks like, this is what a pedomorph salamander looks like. This is about twice the weight, or maybe even 3 times the weight of a normal adult tiger salamander. But this is what they do. So this is this is the hybrid barred tiger salamander with the California native. And you have these reproductive adults that if they have permanent water, they can stay like this their entire life. And so the reason that our native salamanders don't do that is because, remember, they live in ephemeral wetlands, so water that dries up. It wouldn't make sense to have this evolutionary advantage. But in Texas, they stay in permanent water sources. Big problem that these genes are spreading. And it kind of begs the question, so what's going to happen to the native tiger salamander? So this is the native here. And the problem is that wildlife, in the regulatory, service, they don't know what to protect because if we have a native species, well, okay, well, what if it's just 10% not native? Do we still protect it? Because a tiger salamander is an endangered species. So what do we protect? Do we protect 50-50? If it's, we're trying to remove this non-native genes, but it's hard when they're, basically taking over. And so unfortunately, unless we stop this spread in certain areas, we're going to see that we have a hybrid salamander, and that will be what is the California tiger salamander, which is very unfortunate. And then pesticides and pollution is a very big problem. California is, I think, the eighth or seventh largest economy in the world, and a lot of it comes from our agriculture. And so we spray lots of pesticides, and a lot of that runs off into the water. And so frogs are bioindicators. So frogs, they absorb, toxins and chemicals in their skin, and it can have alarming effects. For example, this one on the screen is a Pacific chorus frog that was found in Aptos, California, near Santa Cruz on the central coast. And it has 8 legs. And this is a frog that was living in an area where they spray a lot of pesticides, and all that runs off in the water. These tadpoles absorb it into their body, and they show these effects. So it's important that we study this, because then we can see that these frogs are telling us that there's something going wrong with the environment. It's very important to understand that these animals, we've seen these deformities observed in California, and we should be doing something about it. Yeah, so it's very important to understand that frogs, they tell us the health of ecosystems. Again, very, very important. And so many threats have synergistic effects too. So I talked about all these different threats that are facing California amphibians, and many of them aren't just one thing. And so this is a mountain yellow-legged frog, and this is a species that only live in the Sierra Nevada. There's actually 2 species now, that one in the northern population and the southern population. But both species are gone from 90% of their range. And when researchers were discovering these declines, these frogs, well, one problem is that there's people have been stocking trout, non-native trout, into these naturally fishless lakes into the Sierra Nevada, so people could fish. And these frogs have never evolved to have a fish predator, and trout are voracious predators and would just gobble up these frogs, their tadpoles, their eggs, everything. And so where you have fish, you wouldn't have frogs. But then they still kept declining, and they found out that, okay, even in the areas where there's fishless lakes, these frogs are going extinct. And it's because they also are very susceptible to the Kittridge fungus, which has wiped out over 100 species around the globe. So they're getting attacked by invasive species, these diseases. And lastly, there's been something else studied, is that in some of these high elevation lakes, they found pesticides, which is strange because it's at the top of mountains. There's no agriculture, within miles around. But they found that when we spray pesticides, it gets caught up into the wind, and it gets carried through the clouds and the wind system up into the mountains, and then it finally resides up in these mountains. And these frogs are very susceptible to that. That's called orographic agrochemical drift, and it's having, people are finding that this is actually this is more of a new threat, because people did not realize this was happening. So we found evidence of this around the world. So all these synergistic effects, these combined effects, are having big problems for amphibians around in California. And so Save the Frogs, we're trying to tackle some of these issues. We're based in California, and that's one of the reasons why we're having this discussion. We're based in Santa Cruz, California, and we want to make our state the frog-friendliest state, in the union. And so some of the ways that we're doing it, we're trying to ban these harmful pesticides. A few weeks ago, we had a great talk with Dr. Tyrone Hayes about atrazine and getting it banned. This frog has been changing male frogs into female frogs, and it's very alarming what some of these pesticides have been doing to frogs. And you can only imagine what they're doing with people. So we're leading the fight to ban these harmful pesticides. Also, we're bringing awareness to species at risk. For example, in February 2nd, 2012, the Fish and Game Commission granted endangered species status to the mountain yellow-legged frogs. And this was after we had 1,500 Save the Frog supporters send in letters on behalf of the frogs. And so many times when the regulatory agencies are going to list a species, it goes under the radar. Many people, they don't hear about it. And so we try so hard to find out when they're going to list the species, or when they're considering listing, and getting our supporters to say, hey, this is important, because it is. These animals are clearly endangered. They're gone from 90% of their range. They need more endangered species status. And we also have done this for California tiger salamanders as well. In 2010, we had about 500 letters sent to the Fish and Game Commission and about listing this species as an endangered species. And now, happy to say the California tiger salamander is a federally endangered species. So very, very good to hear these salamanders have more protection in the state of California. We're also removing invasive species and restoring natural ecosystems. So we want to get this bullfrog out of California. So they're a non-native species, and they're now actually banned in Santa Cruz. So what that means when they're banned, it's illegal to own them, to import them, to sell them, to release them. You're not supposed to have these frogs because they are known to cause such widespread degradation. And so we want to make this into a statewide ban because we import about 2 to 3 million non-native bullfrogs in the state of California every year, actually from other countries, not from the East Coast, and from these giant frog farms. And they're covered in that Kittridge fungus. They have other diseases, and sometimes they get out. And when they get out, they not only spread disease, but they also are an invasive species. So they, outcompete our native amphibians. And so we want to get the statewide ban because also our state is spending hundreds of thousands of dollars every single year removing these frogs from areas where they're causing problems. So it doesn't make much sense to keep importing them if we're, you know, if we're trying to protect these native amphibians. And we're going to have a class all about bullfrogs coming up soon. I highly urge you to attend that Save the Frogs Academy class. And so back to habitat restoration in Santa Cruz, California, there's a pond called Antonelli Pond where we're restoring it for native red-legged frogs. And so we're in this photo here, we're removing English ivy, which is a plant that isn't that good for frogs. We're helping remove fish by putting in, basically actually removing fish and also removing bullfrogs as well. So, because there are red-legged frogs in the area, and so if this pond was, without these large species of fish and bullfrogs, and had proper cover for the frogs, it would actually be quite good for them. And also, we encourage schools to build ponds and create habitat. So, and this is cool because the Save the Frogs has a pond contest, and this is the winner of one of our pond contests. And this is a school in San Francisco, California, called Visitation Valley Middle School, and they built this amazing series of ponds in their school garden. And San Francisco is like a concrete jungle. There's not much green space there. You have to go closer to Golden Gate Park, and there's just not too much green space. And frogs are definitely a rarity there. So what this school did is they put these ponds in, and then chorus frogs came, and they actually breed in these ponds now and use it as habitat. So it's a great success story about how you can build a pond and then you have native amphibians coming. Because frogs, again, are kind of rare in San Francisco, so it's great to see that they're breeding in the San Francisco area. And in San Francisco also, it's known to be a very environmentally friendly city, but unfortunately, there has been a huge problem with the Sharp Park wetlands, but it's actually a golf course. And so this golf course has been under fire for many years of violating the Endangered Species Act because it's a poorly constructed golf course that floods every single year. It's located at Pacifica, which is just south of San Francisco, and it's right against the ocean. And every single year, it floods with these winter rains, and all the basically the low-lying areas fill up with water. And what happens is these California red-legged frogs go in there, they see this great habitat, and they breed. Well, what they've been doing is flushing all this water back out to the ocean. And so, frogs, their eggs, all these amphibians are getting flushed out the ocean. So obviously that's causing some problems for the frogs there. And we got a hold of it, and we wanted to, let people know that this is a problem. And so with some other organizations, we actually had a rally on April 29th of 2011, I believe. And it was a rally, it was actually on Save the Frogs Day. Actually, it was 2010, I apologize. And to bring awareness to the threats that the city was doing to these poor frogs. And so it was a pretty good rally. About 100 people turned up, and it brought some awareness to frog conservation. And so we've had a lot of resistance from the city in restoring this to this golf course as a wetland. And we've also had a lot of resistance from golfers. But unfortunately, it only seems to cater to a very select few group of golfers. It doesn't receive very much attendance. And the golf course is actually losing money because of low attendance. And what happens is the city subsidizes that and pays for that. And so keep this golf course open. And so, again, we like to raise a little bit of a stink about it. And so when we were denied permits to have an educational Save the Frogs Day event there, we had a Drumming for the Frogs protest at the Sharp Park in order to bring awareness that the frog is illegally killing endangered frogs. And the park is illegally killing frogs. And so it was a good turnout. We had about 30 supporters and had some news there and definitely brought some awareness for these frogs in San Francisco. So, and the whole point of all this is we're just trying to bring awareness and understand too that there's about over 1,000 golf courses in California, and wetlands are the most threatened habitat on the planet. And so this was a great opportunity for the city to restore these wetlands, make a new national park that many people can enjoy. There's very few green space in San Francisco, and unfortunately, we were denied that. So we had to raise a little bit of attention for it. So again, in response to that, we have many education programs in the San Francisco and Bay Area. And one such program was the San Francisco Tadpole Head Start program, where we educated about over 2,000 students. Because I visited to 30 schools, we received a grant to basically provide free education for students and teachers at these schools in the city of San Francisco. And it was great. It was a great program that we're hoping to continue. And it provided, and the whole idea is that we foster this next generation of students that they don't get out into nature very much. And so therefore, if we bring nature to them, bring this educational materials, they can become educated about amphibian conservation. And the second part of this program is that another group comes in and they bring native chorus frogs, and then they watch the chorus frogs metamorphose into adults, and then those frogs are re-released back in the wild, help for supporting frog populations in the San Francisco area. So it was a great program. We're hoping to continue it again. And also, Save the Frogs Day, we have many events in California. And in 2011, we were very lucky to have Save the Frogs Day in the National Park or the National Wildlife Federation. And so we had at Yosemite, we had these great events bringing awareness to frog declines, and many people learned about frogs going extinct. So there's Ranger Rick of the National Park Service and our frog mascot helping spread the awareness about frogs. And so here's what you can do to help amphibians. If you're attending this class, I'm very thankful that you have. There's so many things that we can do to help amphibians. And so here's a few things that you can do at home and to tell your friends about how you can help amphibians. And so one, we want to slow down driving those wet nights. Road mortality is a big problem for amphibians, and they like to move on these wet, rainy nights. So it's very important that we slow down driving on wet nights. Don't eat frog legs. Very, very simple. Most frogs that are imported to come into LA and San Francisco. And so if you're in those areas, do not purchase frog legs. Some of these frogs do get out to the surrounding, in the rest of California, but that's where most of it is happening. So don't eat frog legs. Encourage your friends to not eat frog legs because it's helping support this trade of invasive species. And so don't dissect frogs too, because this is actually something that people don't know as well, is that it's the same trade. So these frogs, are coming to these biological supply stores, and they're either wild-caught leopard frogs or they're farmed bullfrogs. And again, it's helping spread that invasive species in these, and also it's rather unethical. Most people that dissect frogs, they don't become biologists or scientists. It's just an institutionalized practice that's needless and kills millions of frogs all over the world. And then we want to turn off the tap. Water conservation is incredibly important in California, and we've been in a drought for some time. And we've had, it's actually quite alarming right now because there's a giant fire out in Yosemite, which has burned so many hundreds of acres. And actually, we had to cut off, or we threatened to cut off the water supply of San Francisco, which is obviously a big problem. And so water conservation is very, very important for these reasons of we only have water, fresh water is a finite resource, and it's important that we think about our consumption of water because amphibians use it, they live in it, they breed in it, and we want to leave it to them and other species as well. And then creating a frog pond is a very simple way to bring the frogs to you. Habitat degradation is one of the biggest problems for amphibians around the planet. So building a frog pond in your backyard is great. And we have a website, savethefrogs.com/ponds, that you can learn all about how to build a frog pond and other ways you can help amphibians in your backyard. And we want to vote for the environment. So when, for example, we have a very friendly governor in California right now to the environment, Jerry Brown, and he is very pro-environment. For example, he banned shark fins in the state of California, which caused quite an upset, but it was great. That's great for shark conservation. So we think he would be very receptive to frog conservation as well, and he would support our ban on the bullfrog. And so it's important to vote the environment, keep national parks, state parks open, and so people attend them. So we get more and more people into the environment. And having environmentally friendly politicians is also very, very important. And so, with that, it's up to you guys to save the frogs. And I thank you very much for attending this webinar. And from now, I'm going to answer some questions, and then we'll go off into some Save the Frogs Academy um, information, some things I would like you to do. But first, I want to take an opportunity to answer some questions. I know that was a nice long presentation, and I'm sure some of you have some questions. And so, let me just look at them here. Here's a good question. If we build a pond at home, would our ducks eat the frogs? And that's a good question. So most ducks don't eat frogs. They actually eat, algae or plants. But even if you had some species like maybe a heron, or which is a fish eating, a frog eating specialist, come to your pond, that's okay because that's a natural part of the ecosystem. And so frogs are food for many species of animals, and so it's important to have, you have to have the predators control those frog populations as well. I would just say if you do build a frog pond, do not put mosquito fish in there or other fish because they will eat frog eggs. If you have a pond, I recommend having some sort of a pump that makes the water circulate so you avoid mosquitoes, and it will also attract dragonflies and other insects that keep mosquito populations down. Let's see what else. And if there are any other questions, please let me know. What is the humane way to get rid of backyard pond of bullfrogs? And that is a great question. Unfortunately, I mean, the humane way, so the humane way to remove a bullfrog is there's a chemical that you actually soak the frog in that basically it puts them to sleep and then it slowly kills them. It euthanizes this frog. I believe it's called MS-222. And I don't think it's for public consumption, obviously, because it's a very strong chemical. And so there's a few other ways to remove those frogs, but there's a couple problems with removing bullfrogs in your area because one, if you remove bullfrogs and you're just doing it from your backyard, there's a really good chance that you're just going to get more bullfrogs coming in. Eradication efforts have to be quite intensive. And so that's one of the big problems with removing bullfrogs from anywhere is because you have to keep doing it year and year and year after year. And so if you live in like a suburban neighborhood or if you are in an area that I guess I'll say that there are no other frogs around, but you have bullfrogs. I would just actually leave them there because the amount of effort it's going to take to constantly remove those frogs might be too much. Um, One other thing that I would suggest if you really want to remove bullfrogs in your property is to talk to your local fish and game organization because they have more tips about how you can remove the bullfrogs. They might even remove the bullfrogs from the area. But the problem is, at least in the western states, bullfrogs are so inundated that actually removing them is a big problem. And so it's really right now for removing bullfrogs, the key will be to get them from spreading to areas where endangered species are, and to remove them from those areas where endangered species are, because that's where they're causing the most threats. If it's just bullfrogs and they're not impacting already endangered species or having impact on the species there, then it's almost just best to leave them until we can have the agencies and other groups go and thoroughly remove them. I hope that answers your question. So, what is the fungus that is hurting ponds, and can you say a little about it? The fungus is hurting frogs, and so it's called the Kittridge fungus. And the Kittridge fungus is a waterborne fungus that's all over the world, and it's been spread around through the trade of amphibians, people moving around, trade of water, and it only hurts amphibians. And so in California, we have some species that are especially threatened by it, like the mountain yellowlegged frog and species that live in colder elevations, because this fungus is a cold-loving fungus and it really does best in colder temperatures. However, even in hot temperatures, this fungus can be on an amphibian but not hurt it. It's just like hanging out until it gets to a colder region. And so many amphibians have actually spread it just by living on their skin, but it doesn't actually hurt the amphibian. And so in most ponds, like if your backyard pond or something like that, it's not going to have a problem, the Kittridge fungus, but it might be an issue if you live at higher elevations. And so something to look for if you have frogs in your area, to think about, what species are there? Are the numbers, you know, I mean, do you hear lots of frogs every night, or at least during the times they're active? One thing I recommend to people that like their frogs in the backyard is every year, just when you hear lots of frogs calling, just jot it down, write a few notes about the frogs in your area, and then that way, after year after year after year, you can kind of see trends of when the frogs are coming and going. And many people have noticed declines this way in their area just by keeping records of when the frogs were really active. Sometimes there are natural lapses in activity, but if they just disappear, it's something to be alarmed about, and then to make people aware, whether your local game commission or Save the Frogs, about the frogs that disappear in your area. Do you suggest building a frog in Southern California? That's a great question. So, Southern California, it's kind of a desert. So sometimes I think that it might actually be a little bit of a waste of water, because and I say that just because Southern California uses so much water, and there's so many lawns, and there's definitely, like, we want to be environmentally conscious as possible. And I would only recommend building a pond if there were frogs in your area. And so there's a great website called CaliforniaHerps.com, and it's all about the identification of California amphibians. And you can find out where you are and find out if you have frogs there. And if you live in a more rural area, you probably have frogs, especially looking at the ecosystem around you if you have frogs. So if there's frogs in ponds outside of your property, then yeah, build a pond and get them to come. But if you live in a suburban neighborhood in Southern California, you might be wasting a lot of water. And I hate to say that because you are building habitat, but also you might not actually attract frogs because there may not be frogs in the area. Okay, so this individual has a stock pond that's populated by frogs as soon as it begins to rain in the fall. How can you determine what type of frogs we have, and since they fall silent whenever we approach? That is a problem. And so one way is, again, go to CaliforniaHerps.com, and you look for, if you actually, if you could, it might be good to know what location you're in too, but I'm assuming maybe you're hopefully in California. CaliforniaHerps.com has a lot of recordings of frogs, and there's also a great book called the Amphibians of the Western United States, or something like that, where and it has a recording of all the frog calls in the United States, or in the Western United States, and that could be a little bit daunting because that's a lot of calls. But in California, there really aren't too many species to think about. In the fall, if you have frogs calling, if it's just that ribbit. It's a high pitched. I wonder if I can even pull up a frog call. No, I guess I can't do it right here. But it's a high pitched ribbit chorus of frogs. That's going to be the Pacific chorus frog. If it's a deep call, I mean, like the bullfrog, which is like a really deep call, that's a bullfrog. But they call during the summer months usually. And then if it's a red-legged frog, they have another deep call, but it's I can't even do it because it's so low. So I recommend just going to California.com or CaliforniaHerps.com and hearing the recordings. And so, and also too, if you ever just recorded it like on a smartphone or with a device, and you had it MP3 of it, or something, you could send it to me, and I could probably identify it to you for as well. And my contact is Starkey@SaveTheFrogs.com, and I'd be able to do that for you. So here's an interesting question. So what are the prospects for citizen-led reintroductions to riparian areas that had suffer extirpations? So if we think about people reintroducing frogs to areas like on their own, not with an agency, or this can have a few problems. Because one problem is that we need to make sure that if we're ever going to reintroduce a species to an area, that it's going to work. And so many of the problems are that when these frogs are gone from an area, there's many reasons why they're gone, why they went extinct in that area. And so if people just start reintroducing the frogs, um, there's actually a very low success that it will work. And so, and I don't, hopefully that doesn't sound too negative, but it's just for the reason that amphibian reintroductions, typically don't work very well. It's just amphibians are very sensitive animals, and we're still learning the best way to do it. And so I recommend that if people want to get involved with reintroducing species, they're very careful, and they work through Fish and Game or other wildlife agencies, because that's kind of their specialty. They're making sure that it's going to work, and they're going to have long-term monitoring programs that are going to ensure that those species are surviving. Because if we just take one frog, from one part of California and move to another, that's a very bad idea, because we can spread disease. And there's all these threats that can possibly affect those frogs and transmit other diseases to other frogs. So I don't recommend it at all. And I recommend people getting involved with their local Fish and Game organization or other nature organizations too, and see about getting in some citizen science programs that could help, reintroduce species if to repopulate an area. And that website was California Herps. Herps is short for herpetology, which is spelled HERPS.com. I'm going to answer a couple more questions, and then I will have to unfortunately move on. And I really appreciate all these great questions. And so, if you want a pond and you want to, again, if you're worried about mosquitoes, it's very important. Mosquitoes, are an unfortunate part of nature. They are there, but to avoid mosquitoes, you have water that is flowing. So I recommend, if you have a pond, have some sort of circulation in there, and also attract predators. And so I mean insect predators. So dragonflies. Um, there's also the damselflies, there's beetle larvae. These are all voracious predators of mosquitoes. And so I recommend having that. So having flowing water and those natural predators. If you want frogs, I don't recommend mosquito fishing, and I definitely don't recommend spraying. So yeah, don't keep stagnant water and have that water flowing. And here's a great question. So what's a way we can prevent Kittridge fungus from spreading? And so one way is that whenever you're going hiking, especially if you're going hiking in California and you're going to wet areas. One thing that scientists do is that we actually have to quarantine, or sorry, not quarantine, but decontaminate everything that we're going to be using. And so a simple way to do that, if you're going to some remote areas, like high in the Sierras, I highly recommend you keep bleach and make a 10% bleach solution with water in your truck or your car, and just spray down your boots, rub your boots, get all that mud off. And you want to decontaminate your whatever gear you're going to be walking from site to site. Because many, for example, backpackers in the Sierra Nevada, or campers, hikers, they're not thinking about spreading this Kittridge fungus. But that's one way in California we can stop spread that, by decontaminating whatever gear we're using. So that's one way. Also, ways to prevent Kittridge, being careful with water bodies, just like, I mean, if we're in a low-lying area like in the Central Valley, it's not too much of a concern, because unfortunately Kittridge is spread throughout much of California. But it's really those sensitive habitats in the Sierra Nevada where they might affect those high elevation frogs. So I got one last question. So, as a student myself and another student have thought of starting a microscope club, we are considering collecting locally found dead specimens that our university may be willing to keep on ice for later dissection purposes. Do you think there are any ethical issues regarding this? Um, Not, it's hard to say. So there are a couple issues with that, with collecting dead specimens. One, technically in the state of California, if you are to collect anything dead found in the wild, you need a permit for it. And you need so you would go with Fish and Game, you explain, this is what I want to do for this club. I need a permit, because it's called a salvage permit. So, because the idea though is, when there's locally, amphibians that are dead out in the environment for whatever reason, we want to assume that's a natural cause, and that animals are going to be, ingesting, the dead frogs, or it becomes back into the environment, right? Those frogs are going to break apart, become part of the soil again, And so it's important to leave those dead animals out where we found them. But I might recommend that if you did want to dissect dead frogs, sometimes Fish and Game actually removes tons of bullfrogs, and all they do is euthanize them. And so they have many habitat restoration sites where they remove bullfrogs, and all those frogs are thrown in the trash. And so if you really wanted to dissect those frogs, I would recommend going that way. Frogs that had been, captured, part of a restoration effort. And if you had more specific questions, just because I'm a little short on time, that I'm going to have to move forward, but please send me an email at Starkey, Starkey, at savethefrogs.com. Okay, so I'm going to have to move forward a little bit. And so I just wanted to say that I have homework assignments for you guys. There's a few things that we can do to help frogs today. And one of them is we are working to ban the bullfrog in California. And we're going to have a class all about dissections and bullfrogs in California coming up. And I'll say that in a second. But the bullfrog is one of the greatest threats to amphibians in California because it's basically eating them to extinction. And so getting them banned in California is something that we're going to be working on in the next few months. And so stay on. If you're interested in this, we're looking for a volunteer for 4 hours a week for a commitment of 1 year. And hopefully it's not going to take us that long if we get this ban rolling. We already have about 10,000 petition signatures. And so we feel that we have a very reasonable case, especially since we had bullfrogs banned in the city of Santa Cruz. So that's one thing. And today, so we have an assignment for you where we need more protection for the mountain yellow-legged frog. The Center for Biological Diversity just sent out a request for letters to send to the Fish and Wildlife Service because the Fish and Wildlife Service is looking to protect many, many acres in the Sierra Nevada for the 2 species of mountain yellow-legged frog and the Yosemite toad, which are all endangered species. And so it's important that we, get this federally protected land and keep it that way. But we've had politicians and I'm not kidding, Tea Party groups and many ranchers that are vehemently opposed to this, and they're causing quite a bit of stir. And so we need to urge our local Fish and Game and also the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to protect these frogs. And so your homework is to go right after this class to the Facebook, the SaveTheFrogs.com, or Facebook / Save the Frogs. And the first post on there is going to be, your homework, which is to submit a comment to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service protecting these frogs. And I urge you to do that, and please share it with your friends. We're going to have a class next, this second actually, on how to save the mountain yellow-legged frogs, because this is going to be a big issue in about a month from now. And so upcoming Save the Frogs Academy classes, I hope you can all attend on September 1st, how university students can help save the frogs. We'll have Save the Frogs Brianna Binder that's going to talk all about that, how universities can get involved. On the 4th, we'll have an intro to amphibian conservation in Espanol or in Spanish. And then on the 8th, we're going to talk all about dissections. And so that'll be a great discussion. On the 11th, we're going to learn more about the Kittridge fungus, and that'll be led by Dr. Kerry Kriger, who studied the Kittridge fungus in Australia. So I recommend, if anyone's interested in the Kittridge fungus, how it spread, how we can stop that spread, to attend that class. On September 15th, we're going to talk about how to organize a frog event in your city. And I'm going to add a few things about that, because in California, there's a brewery here called Lagunitas Brewery, and they like to host nonprofits. And so that's one way that we can help, is just get these places that are for nonprofits to hold a Save the Frogs event. And then on the 18th of September, we're going to talk about volunteering for Save the Frogs. The 22nd, we're going to be joined by Gilbert Adum, who is the executive director of Save the Frogs Ghana. And we're going to talk all about the great successes that Save the Frogs Ghana has accomplished in the last 2 years. And on the 25th, we're going to talk again about Sharp Park and invasive bullfrogs. So I apologize to correct myself, that not dissections of bullfrogs, it'll be Sharp Park and bullfrogs. We're going to talk about the golf course that kills endangered species and these invasive bullfrogs that are spreading all over the United States. October 2nd, if you want to help California frogs, please join us on the 2nd to talk about saving the mountain yellow-legged frogs. And then on the 6th, we're going to talk about how teachers can help save the frogs. And so you can register for classes at savethefrogs.com/classes, or on the Academy page, which is savethefrogs.com/academy. and stay up to date on our Twitter and Facebook because we will have many updates as well. And a couple other things. Our Belize Eco Tour, the 2013 Eco Tour was a great success, so we're excited to have it again on the in June of 2014. And you can find more out about that on saythefrogs.com/ecotours. We found a lot of frogs, and we would love for you to go and join us out in Belize. And then Say the Frogs art contest and poetry contest is winding down. The last time to submit an entry is in the 15th of October, so please get those in to us now. We're looking forward to seeing your art, and we'll announce a winner soon. And then Say the Frogs Day is coming up this following April, April 26, 2014, a day to celebrate amphibians and bring awareness to their conservation. We're hoping to make this the largest Say the Frogs Day in history, where last year we had over 15,000 people learned about frogs. And so we're hoping to do the same this year, plus a lot more. And so you can find out more about that on saythefrogs.com/day. So, and please donate to Say the Frogs. You know, we offer all of these classes for completely free. We've never received any money from any government, and we rely on donations and gift sales to help fund our efforts around the world to spread information about the amphibian extinction crisis. And so if you like what we do, if you like these classes, please donate for our time to help cover expenses and to help us spread the mission of Say the Frogs. And so thank you all so much for joining the saythefrogs.com Say the Frogs Academy class. If you have any other questions that I could not answer, please send me an email at starkey@savethefrogs.com, and that's STARKEY, and I would be happy to answer them. Thank you so much for joining me at the Say the Frogs Academy class, and see you next time.